This presentation is a look at poverty through the deontological ethics. It is by Bella McLeod, Kenna Horgan, Sam Pierman, Skylar Jones, and Mia Milosevic. This slide summarizes deontological ethics. Immanuel Kant's claims that goodwill cannot be taught, measured, or destroyed. He also argued that law, inclination, and duty are all things that can guide reasoning. Inclination, duty, and legislative law are things that help to establish our reason. And he also claims that someone with a good will would choose duty over inclination because it is the morally correct thing to do. Also, legislative laws subdue both duty and inclination. His claims are upheld by the people with the same exact circumstances and situations.
The following are some quotes that we felt best summarized Kant's philosophy. Firstly, we do not need science and philosophy to know what we should do to be honest and good, even wise and virtuous. Indeed, we might well have conjectured beforehand that the knowledge of what every man is bound to do. Here we see Kant's idea that that the human race shouldn't let science and philosophy affect their morals, and in fact, they should do it based on duty and knowing what to do. The next quote. A disposition to argue against these strict laws of duty and to question their validity, or at least their purity and strictness, and if possible, to make them more accordant with our wishes and inclinations, this is to say, to corrupt them at their very source, and entirely to destroy their worth, a thing which even common practical reason cannot ultimately call good. Kant is saying that adjusting what is right to be convenient to others or to oneself takes away from the validity and the credibility, and it therefore corrupts morals, and when we are inclined to do what is right against social needs and biases and selfish needs, that is when we see duty. And finally, for in this case we can readily distinguish whether the action which agrees with duty is done from duty or from a selfish view. It is much harder to make this distinction when the action accords with duty and the subject has besides a direct inclination to do it. Here Kant is saying that reason clouds what we know is right, and we have a natural duty aside from selfish inclinations to do the morally correct thing. The next article, The Negative Impact of Poverty on the Health of Women and Children, really focused on how indebted nations, if they were allowed to pay debts back later, could redivert this money that they pay in debt reparations into health and education, and that this would actually save about 7 million children's lives a year in impoverished nations. It also focused on the health of women, specifically when it comes to childbirth, and stated that maternal mortality is the second leading cause of death among women of reproductive age. And so this is obviously a very pressing issue because it has such high death rates, but there is the technology and the medicine to stop this. Next, female impoverishment leads to low educational status, unemployment, and limited access to property. So in these impoverished countries, women aren't getting the right access to what they need, so they live these lives of poverty where they have no opportunity. Roughly 45% of child deaths in 2011 were caused by malnutrition, and this shows that there was a lack of medicine and education and food to teach the kids and to have the kids eating enough nutrients to survive. And then malnutrition impedes on cognitive and physical development and significantly increases the risks of acquiring a degenerative disease. So it really focused on how we could divert money back into impoverished nations to help them develop and ultimately save the lives of women and children across the world. And so that's just how we felt it was best summarized.
The following slide is an analysis of poverty based on Kant's form. Kant decrees that categorical imperative is unconditional, meaning that regardless of one's own desires, it must be followed. In other words, regardless of one's own inclination, it is their moral duty to abide by the law rather than their individual desires. Deontology itself means duty ethics, and Kant believes that everyone has an inherent duty and moral code. This moral code lies within the complete trust of law and abidance of law, as opposed to a moral code driven by inclination. In the case of poverty, regardless of whether one wants to help someone, it is their categorical imperative or duty to aid that person, meaning that if someone is poverty-stricken or a region is poverty-stricken, one should look to legislation and law in order to guide their moral imperative to help this populace. A moral code exists within law and legislation. Law should be decided based on universal morality and truths, based on the formula of autonomy. No one is higher than the law. Law serves as a moral right for individuals to serve their own individual truths. This, as previously mentioned, means that laws trump all inclination, and that under any circumstance, inclination should not take place over legislation that is implemented by governments wherever you are living. In relation to poverty, one should facilitate their moral duty to help, but must keep in mind that help within the limits of law is essential in order to maintain order from Kant's perspective. I read you mine.
In an analysis of poverty based on Kant's form, for an action to be morally correct based on his system, the person who commits a deed should have selfless intentions behind their actions. Thus, they should not have any other form of motivation in completing an action. And in the case of poverty, people should help those who are poverty-stricken due to their own duty, not in fact to make themselves look more charitable, which is a common cause for combating poverty. A lot of people want to look charitable and make themselves look better, so they donate to charities and help those who are poverty-stricken. Kant argues that instead it should be an internalized motivation and one without any outside influences. This policy also emphasizes the vitality of governmental reform in order to eliminate poverty. It promotes a legislative basis to follow when dealing with the poverty-stricken nations, not in fact a more loose humanitarian-based process. Legislation or law also is said to trump inclination, making governmental reform essential in reducing poverty. In effect, he argues that in reducing poverty, it should originate within the government and governmental reform and regulations. An important issue to address when looking at a topic is the shortcomings, counterclaims, and pitfalls that it may induce. In the case of Kant's philosophy, an overemphasis on laws and legislations may in fact become counterproductive when looking at the fact that humans are generally incapable of acting solely on duty, and that usually they have another motivation when doing something. In addition, inclination oftentimes overpowers law, even though Kant's form advises against such. It is therefore not necessarily the most realistic form of philosophy. Another pitfall is that not everything is universal, so it is highly unlikely that written law could account for every circumstance. And in the case of poverty, each country has a very different set of needs, and thus the laws would have to be very different for each country. No one universal truth, and thus no one universal law. Next, in assuming that each law will be built off of moral truth, it is unreasonable. There is no way that individuals could reach a common consensus when amending universal law, especially not for the topic as vast as poverty. We must remember and reinforce the fact that poverty is very diverse of an issue, and that each country requires different regulations in order to solve it.
Throughout our research, we came up with some questions that Kant did not address, like how can we decipher the pureness of one's intentions and their actions? Also, what are the confines of duty? We also wondered, how can all written law account for universal truth? And in what ways can we account for morality in laws addressing poverty? We also wondered if an illegal measure to alleviate poverty is more effective, should it be condemned? And how many people should believe something for it to become universal truth? Lastly, how can a universal truth or law be created on a topic as region-specific as poverty?